Good evening. I am Franz Rojas Ortuste from CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, and I'm honored to be the moderator of this session about the role of public development banks on accelerating wash access to all, which is part of the World Water Week 2021 and is a part of our initiative launch last November at the Finance in Common Summit. As you can see in the chat, you have simultaneous translation to either French or Spanish, and we're going to follow mostly in English during the session. For the opening remarks, let me first introduce Mr. Gilles Kleitz. He is a director of the Department of Ecological Transitions and Natural Resources at the French Development Agency. Please, Mr. Kleitz, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. Dear colleagues and water friends, it is my great pleasure today and honor to welcome you as well to this World Water Week session, where we will focus on the role of public development banks in increasing the pace of providing access to water, sanitation, and hygiene for all. Even though most of you are well aware of it, I would like to start with a simple reminder. The world is not on track to achieve most SDGs, and this is particularly true if we look into climate, into biodiversity, and as well, unfortunately, on SDG 6 on water and sanitation. They will not be reached if we keep with the current pace of action. Wake-up calls are now loud and clear, and a responsibility, as we have seen at Fix One as well, as water and nature practitioner, is to find a way to really drive a fundamental change. And this meeting today is really about this drive. At the French Development Agency, we strongly believe that shifting the modus operandi of financial players is really a critical process in this drive. Public finance institutions with general interest at the heart of their mandate should really pave the way towards investing more in SDGs, in climate, in water, in biodiversity agreements, and they should pull private finance in the same direction. This idea of a stronger SDG development finance alignment led AFD and many friends and colleagues from other banks to host last November the Finance in Common Summit, which gathered about 450 international, national, and local public development banks, representing 10% of annual global investment worldwide. Many of these banks are now forming a coalition and have expressed their willingness to contribute to the recovery process following the COVID crisis and to really align with sustainable finance principle as well as achieving the SDGs. AFD is working to do its part. We now aim at having 100% of our financing being compatible with the Paris Agreement, with 50% of those including an adaptation or mitigation contribution, and a lot of them with water components. We have also combined our climate objective with our ambition on biodiversity. Our target is actually to have 30% of our climate finance encompassing a biodiversity contribution. So for AFD, you see climate, biodiversity, and water work really hand in hand. We all know here at the World Water Week how crucial water and sanitation are to reach the SDGs in general. We can also say that the financing issues faced by the sector are very revealing of the challenging facing the world of sustainable finance. Performance inefficiencies, governance issues, market inconsistencies prevent finance demand and offer to meet, really. And we think that public development banks have proven in many contexts that they can be catalysts to finance water and sanitation investments. So we decided last November with many of you around the table, and especially together with the European Investment Bank, with the Corporación Andina de Fomento, with the World Bank and other development banks, to launch a water finance coalition among development banks to really further this effort. AFD, who is presently chairing this coalition, commissioned a study to IRC to feed our common work and establish a bit the state of the situation in terms of water and sanitation and hygiene finance. And I'm really glad that the results of the study will be presented to you today. So I wish you, with these words, a very good working session, and we'll now leave you in the hands of Julian Suarez to provide you with more insights on the water sanitation and hygiene financing challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kleitz. Now, as Dr. Kleitz said, it's the turn of Mr. Julian Suarez Migliosi. He's the Vice President of Sustainable Development at CAF. Please, Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Franz. Thank you, Gilles. Dear colleagues, co-conveners, French Development Agency, the European Development Bank, also colleagues from the World Bank, Banobras and Etapa, good afternoon, good evening. It is a pleasure to address some opening remarks to complement what Gilles was saying and to discuss on the role of public development banks to boost water-related SDGs. As we've seen throughout this week, a significant amount of capital investment is required to achieve SDG 6. Still, worldwide, more than 2 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water, and almost half of the world's population does not have access to safe sanitation. So bearing this in mind, some studies point that worldwide investment requirements are of around $200 billion per year. As for Latin America and the Caribbean, if the pace of investment remains as it's been for the last decade, SDG 6 would not be reached before 2038. So as public and philanthropic finance is not sufficient to bridge this human right gap, other sources of financing need to be mobilized, including those coming from commercial financing. But however, in many developing countries, the participation of the private capital in financing water and sanitation services has been historically limited due to many constraints, such as the lack of sustainable revenue streams, deficiencies in project design, the lack of understanding by both financial institutions and potential investors, service fragmentation, and a poor risk-return profile. And on top of that, the water sector faces challenges to strengthen institutions' capacity and develop a proper and enabling environment, as Gilles was saying. So in this context, emerges the relevance of placing PDBs to participate and to attract private investment into the water and sanitation sector. I totally agree with Gilles saying that IFIs can act as catalysts in raising financing to the sector. And I will add to this, to his wake-up call for a fundamental change, that IFIs can also complement the catalytic role along with technical assistance that can be provided in many ways. Just to share an example, by the end of 2018, CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, launched a water project preparation facility with an allocation of $5 million of non-reimbursable resources on a per-year basis that is currently managing $20 million with the aim to finance project readiness and thus contribute to accelerate investment in many countries of Latin America and the Caribbean by improving the quality of studies in their final stage of development right before implementation. It is worth noting in this regard that one of the studies for a wastewater treatment plant in Ecuador is co-financed jointly by CAF and the AFD, and we expect, of course, to enlarge the pipeline of studies under alliances with other MDBs and bilateral cooperation. Also, as development banks, we're called to bring and disseminate knowledge to crowd in finance to the sector. For instance, and as pointed out in an earlier session on blended finance, despite the growing interest on blended finance for water and sanitation, some estimates show that it accounts for less than 2% of the total private finance channel to the sector. So understanding the complexities, but also the opportunities, we can move forward. And this is why the Task Force on Financing Water commissioned by the World Water Council, CAF is leading the task force on blended finance as a structuring comprehensive approach rather than just as an investment approach, by including typologies and diverse objectives, whether it might be financial return, social impact, or both. Having said that, the Water Finance Coalition, launched jointly by AFD, the European Investment Bank, and CAF, in coordination with with Sanitation and Water for All, the World Bank, and other PDBs in 2020, is an excellent and necessary platform to exchange knowledge, but more important, to commit to intensifying cooperation and alliances between PDBs and stakeholders to improve financing to the water sector. I conclude by saying that achieving SDG 6, the Paris Agreement goals, and the post-2020 global biodiversity targets seems challenging, and it certainly is, but it is possible if we address a joint effort to develop innovative sources of financing, well-prepared project readiness, and an adequate enabling environment to increase SDG financing overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Gilles Kleitz and Julian Suarez for your inspiring and insightful words. Now we have the presentation following the agenda of a study conducted by IRC about the role of PDBs, the public development banks, in financing the water and sanitation SDG 6. This study, as Jill said, was commissioned by the AFD and was revised by specialists from IFIs, CAF included, also national PDBs and think tank institutions. So we would like to thank Celine Robert and her team for making possible this study. And let me introduce now Steph Smith, who was working along with Catarina Fonseca and others from IRC during the last year and part of this year. So please, Fabiana or Florencia, let us share the screen, and we have 10 minutes for your presentation. So please go ahead, Steph.
Okay, thank you, Franz and others. Good afternoon, everyone. This presentation will thus, as Franz said, highlight the results of the research done into the role of national PDBs in financing the water-related investments, either in relation to SDG 6 or the water-related goals of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. There are some 450 PDBs worldwide. These are banks that are located within the public sphere, either by mandate, by ownership, or by governance. And as such, they deliver on public policy objectives that support the economic and social development of a country or region. And water is obviously a clear public policy objective in many countries. So a key assumption of our research is that PDBs have a high potential to raise finance for achieving SDG 6 and the water-related Paris Agreement goals. Nevertheless, we also see that PDBs are often absent from discussions on financing water. And one of the hypotheses of our research was that PDBs are not yet fulfilling their full potential everywhere and that they are underused. In order to test that hypothesis, but also to generate recommendations for achieving the full potential, this research looked into the past and current roles of PDBs and into the strengths and weaknesses of PDBs in financing the water sector. Next slide, please. The research was done on the basis of a review of literature, the database of all PDBs in the world, and crucially through interview-based case studies of some 13 national PDBs and 16 international finance institutions, IFIs, from different parts of the world. Next slide, please. The research found that indeed in some countries, PDBs have been key players in financing water-related investments, particularly in several countries in Europe and Latin America. And in those cases where PDBs are indeed active in the water sector, water represents around 5 to 15% of the PDB's loan portfolio. The relative role of PDBs vis-à-vis other sources of finance was not always possible to establish, but where data existed, PDBs finance around 10% of all sector investments. And within the water sector, PDBs tend to focus primarily on water supply and sanitation infrastructure. Typically, they fund the larger stepwise investments in, for example, treatment plants and sewerage systems. PDBs tend to be less involved in water resources management, including, for example, stormwater drainage. And that is, amongst others, because there is a less clear revenue model linked to such infrastructure from which borrowers can pay back loans. Climate change adaptation and biodiversity are less clearly defined as sectors to which PDBs provide finance. Rather, they are seen as side benefits of water investments. Next slide. PDBs exercise their role by providing different types of financial and technical services. The key service, which all PDBs provide, is providing repayable finance. That may take different forms, for example, by balance sheet finance, credit for specific infrastructure investments, or what is called project finance, for which special purpose vehicles may be established. Also, most PDBs play a role in structuring the finance, coming to the detailed arrangement for co-financing between various parties, defining the terms and conditions. And most PDBs are active in financing project preparation, sometimes through grants, sometimes through repayable finance, if the preparation leads to a bankable project. So technical support to performance improvement of utilities and local government may be financed. Finally, some of the PDBs fulfill additional roles in, for example, influencing sector reforms, channeling public finance, and administrating trust funds for the water sector. Next slide. The research identified a number of constraints that PDBs face in fulfilling their role, as well as examples of measures that they take to overcome these constraints. Without mentioning all the ones listed here, one can already see that most of the constraints are demand-side related. That is, the effective demand for finance coming from prospective borrowers. For example, local governments may face fiscal discipline limitations, or utilities may underperform financially and are thus not in a position to take on or repay loans. Or even they may have limitations in capacity to prepare bankable projects in the first place. Therefore, one of the key sets of measures or services provided by PDBs is technical assistance to utilities and local governments in project preparation and performance improvement. On the supply side, one of the more frequently heard limitations is the pressure within PDBs to focus on those sectors that have high capacity to take on loans and pay them back. Water is unfortunately often not among them, but PDBs can overcome that by establishing specific mandates or units or departments to work in the water sector. Next slide, please. We also looked into how IFIs work together with PDBs. The research revealed that in the water sector, IFIs do not yet regularly channel their investment with or via PDBs. First of all, because in many places there are no PDBs with a water sector mandate. And secondly, because PDBs tend to focus on a very specific niche group of clients, in many cases, mid-sized utilities and local governments. IFIs often also cater for larger utilities and cities, which can get loans often directly from an IFI, and then there is no need to go via a PDB. Yet collaboration between IFIs and PDBs offers some advantages. PDBs can on-lend to that specific niche group of the more dispersed, smaller mid-sized borrowers. Secondly, for larger investments, there is an opportunity for co-financing between IFIs and national PDBs, and that is something that we saw happening more often. Thirdly, IFIs have often a very good credit rating and can therefore attract capital at cheaper rates, which would then allow national PDBs to on-lend at lower rates too. Finally, national PDBs also provide a good solution for investments in the sector in those places where IFIs do not have local offices. Next slide, please. Based on these and other findings, the research confirmed the main hypothesis that PDBs are underused in the sector and that there is a potential to further enhance that role. We saw the historic evidence that PDBs have played an important role to support water sector development at scale, particularly in what are now high-income countries such as France, Italy, the Netherlands. But also in middle-income countries, PDBs have played and continue to play that key role, for example, in Turkey and Mexico and Brazil, several other countries. And that is where there's a well-established role for national PDBs in the water sector. But even they are not always working to their full potential and are still facing a number of constraints, mostly on the demand side. Finally, there are many countries where there are national PDBs, but which do not yet have a mandate in the water sector or only have a nascent or very limited role. That implies there are untapped opportunities. Next slide. In order to enhance the potential of PDBs or to tap into those opportunities, we have identified a number of recommendations. These recommendations derive from the examples of measures taken by PDBs, but also by governments and by IFIs to overcome those constraints. So all the recommendations you see here are practical examples of what can be done and what has been done already by PDBs and IFIs and governments. So zooming into them, next slide, please. And I'm not going to read out all the recommendations. They are available in the report. Here, I just want to highlight a few. One of the key ones is to establish policy dialogues on sector finance strategies and the role that can be played by PDBs in sector financing. Obviously, PDB finance is not the one and only solution to all financial needs in the sector. Moreover, for PDB finance to work, also other elements of the sector financial framework need to be in place. Crucially, the framework for tariffs and its regulation. Governments need to lead such dialogues, but PDBs and IFIs need to proactively engage with those. Next slide, please. Another key recommendation that I want to highlight is that PDBs should, for as much as they can, establish dedicated windows for project preparation, for utility performance improvement, and for technical project execution. In many countries that we looked at, prospective borrowers will face limitations in these areas. So if PDBs want to provide loans to the sector, they will need to generate a demand and the capacity to use the loans effectively. This requires dedicated windows for that, and indeed, often those are grant or publicly funded. By taking on these and other recommendations, we consider that PDBs can indeed reach a more fuller potential in financing the water-related investments. Next slide. And luckily, as several already mentioned, a number of the PDBs are joining forces to learn from each other, to share ideas on how to overcome these limitations and to build the alliances. And that is done under the Water Finance Coalition. That is also where very soon you will find the full report and all the relevant material. For now, we have uploaded the report on the page of this session. So if you go to the file section, you can download it there, but it will be soon available online as well. Thank you very much. And back to you, Frans.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steph, for sharing the main outcomes of this study. And we invite you all to review this interesting study that, as Steph mentioned, it's uploaded in the chat box. You can see under the files, and we will have it also in the platform of the Water Finance Coalition. So thank you, Steph, for sharing this study. Now we are going to have an interesting panel composed by two representatives of IFIs, AFD and the World Bank, also a national public development bank, Banobras, and the perspective of a water utility, in this case from Latin America. So please, I invite to join me Celine Robert. She is the head of Water and Sanitation Division at AFD and also chair of the Water Finance Coalition. Welcome, Celine. Midori Makino. She is the lead water and sanitation specialist from the World Bank. Thank you, Midori, for joining us. Carlos Puente is also with us. He is the Director of Water, Energy, and Environment at the National Fund of Infrastructure, FONADIN, in Banobras, Mexico. And also, he's the co-chair of the Water Finance Coalition. And last but not least, Rubén Benítez. He is the general manager in Etapa, the municipal utility of Cuenca in Ecuador. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, Ingeniero Benítez. As you know, we have mentioned before, you can hear the simultaneous translation following the interaction app. So now let's start with the questions to each one. To Celine Roberts, we listened to the main outcomes of the study with very much attention, and based on these outcomes, we would like to know, and please share with us about planning and the expected outcomes to move forward under this Water Finance Coalition umbrella that was launched last November. Please, Celine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frans, and thank you for having us today. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. The study is definitely an important milestone for the coalition, and it is a great satisfaction for AFD to see that it is disseminated today. And what I would like to do is to insist on 5 points from the report, which appears to me particularly interesting for the coalition. As it was already said, the coalition's rationale is to explore the potential for an increased mobilization of PDBs and especially national development banks in financing the WASH sector. And my first takeaway from the report would be that actually it's obvious, but it's better when we say it. It is actually comforting us that the coalition is a relevant initiative, because the report is confirming that national development banks and public development banks are in many cases a very appropriate tool to finance water and sanitation investment, and also to crowd in private sector investors. So that was my first point. Secondly, I think the study is showing well, and Steph mentioned them, that there are some constraints that have to be addressed for PDBs and national development banks, especially to succeed in financing water and sanitation. And to say it short, the demand and the offer of financing do not meet spontaneously. So national development banks need specific financial tools such as project preparation fund and TA. They need dedicated skills, expertise to be able to invest in the water and sanitation sector. And I believe that building a network to share experience and good practices among public development banks can definitely help in reinforcing the bank's capacity. So this is exactly what we have started to do and what we intend to do more with the coalition. My third point, and the third interesting aspect that I see in the study, is that it shows that although international finance institutions and national development banks are not working so often together, there is a real complementarity on which we should work between them. So for example, it was said international finance institutions have tools to de-risk investment, like grant funding, like guarantees, and they can help national development banks to come on board of the water and sanitation sector. And on the other side, the national development banks can channel funds from us, the IFIs, and they can enable us to reach other types of beneficiaries, such as mid-sized utilities. If we look at this issue of complementarity, I also think the report shows that it's not so often, but national development banks, they can usefully influence policies and regulatory reforms, as well as the performances of the utilities. This issue of the enabling environment is really a high priority for many international finance institutions. It's the case for CAF, it's the case for AFD, it's the case for AIB. And we often, IFIs, we often coordinate among each other in a given country to lead the conversation with government. And I believe there is room, and it would be positive that such coordination is enlarged, includes more the national development banks together with international finance institutions. As a fourth point, I have also noticed that the study, and maybe it was not so mentioned in the presentation, the study is informing us, sadly, that climate change and biodiversity are not yet demand drivers for water investments. And this is quite symptomatic, I think, of the fact that strategies of finance players have not shifted enough yet. And the collaboration among PDBs to progress on that issue has already been identified by the coalition participant as a priority area for us to work on. So our intent is to make sure that the contribution of water and sanitation investment to climate and biodiversity objective is well understood and is well integrated by all members. So we will talk during the next meeting of the coalition in October about that issue. And my last point would be to say that the coalition plans to be active in upcoming events, international events like the Rome Second Financing Common Summit in October, and also the World Water Forum in Dakar next March. And it appears to me critical that we reach out to all types of stakeholders. We need to talk among public development banks, but we need to talk also to other stakeholders, including governments. And I believe that the report is really, the study is really encouraging us on that point in this direction, because it shows clearly that governments have a critical role to unlock the potential of national development banks in financing water and sanitation, because governments can give a mandate to them. Governments are absolutely needed to work on the enabling environment as well. And a last word, if you allow me, the study is already an important step, will help us to go forward in our work, but there are some more research that is needed to feed the work of the coalition. You can see in the report that it lists further areas that have to be explored. And so I would like to take this opportunity to make a call to any stakeholder that will be willing to collaborate with us and to create more knowledge around public development banks in the water sector. And I will stop that. Thank you very much, Franz.
Thank you very much, Celine. Yeah, very insightful comments, and we have some takeaways coming from that. And as IFIs can catalyze investment, we have heard also that PDBs can influence on the enabling environment because they are working close to the government. So very interesting. Now let's go to Midori Makino, and let me ask you, Midori, the World Bank, as we all know, is one of the biggest IFI with many instruments, with loans, grants, guarantees, credit lines, but also with strong background on disseminating knowledge management. How the World Bank support on increasing financing, but also on the enabling environment that Celine has mentioned to foster the achievement of SDG 6? And how do you see this water finance coalition might help in boosting more investment and attention to SDG 6 compliance? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franz, for that introduction. And also thank you for inviting me to this event. It's a very exciting topic of public development banks. In answering your question about how the World Bank and this proposed water finance coalition could contribute to the achievement of the SDGs, I totally agree with the previous speakers about the need and the urgent need to really partner and collaborate among these key stakeholders. And in doing so, I think it's really important to also maximize the synergies of our work, and also to really use our comparative advantages to jointly work together. So in that context, I wanted to talk about what the World Bank could bring, and what from my perspective, what the roles that we can play. The first one is really to link our operations with the strategic, priorities at the global and regional and country level, with our global presence. And one of the things we do is to develop strategies at at the higher level, as well as the country level, in partnership with the countries. And the most recent one being the GRID framework that we initiate that the World Bank is called the Green, Resilient, and Inclusive Framework. Even if at the global practice level, at the water global practice level, we have priorities in sustaining water resources. It's a 3-pillar: sustaining water resources, delivering services, and building resilience. So that is my first point. Second is our convening power that we use to bring in the partners together in a given region or a country, and catalyze actions for global agendas, and in bringing in innovative solutions to solve development challenges. In this context, I think we can really bring the global knowledge, the lessons that we collect from the non-lending and lending operations that we have all over the world, And here I would like to give some examples of our global solution group tools that we use in different countries. First one being the water security diagnostic, and this is it's a tool to identify the most critical challenges, water challenges in a given region or country, to really raise the awareness of the water importance of water with the policymakers. So that is the first one. We also have a circular economy initiative that's ongoing, which is to really change the paradigm shift to advocate from moving away from the linear thinking to more circular one in doing design or implementation of any infrastructure investment. We also have a more utility level initiative for the utility of the future, which is really to look at what are the key priorities for a utility in really transforming themselves to be the forward-looking utility. We have citywide inclusive sanitation. You know, we talked about the big gap in sanitation. We have through this, you know, we focus more on the behavior change and the enabling environment rather than asset creation for on-site sewage, centralized model. Finally, policy, institutional regulation. We, you know, the previous speakers talked about the enabling environment. We really have a strong product line on this aspect. And here I would like to give a concrete example of a recently completed analytical work that I led for Brazil. To give a context, Brazil had a law, water and sanitation law approved in 2020. And the goal was to achieve universal coverage by 2033. In our study, we found that you know, the expected investment of achieving this target was actually, you know, 3 or 4 times more. So what they had planned was not going to be enough. So there, as a result, it's going to be take 20 more years for the country to achieve their goal. They're not going to achieve it by 2033. It's going to be like 2050. So same as the, you know, SDG target, we're going to fall behind. So this calls for an urgent action to really mobilize more financing to not just Brazil, but this is just an example. It's for the same thing that goes for other countries. So through our tool, we identified some reform options that we recommended to the government, and these included how to strengthen the regulatory framework to really you know, create a better governance framework for the utilities and municipalities in the country. We also proposed some options to create regionalized utility models. We also proposed some you know, ways to really not forget about the unserved population, the rural and the peri-urban population to be the focus. So given the interest of time, I'll stop here, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take any. I also have examples from other regions. Being the World Bank, we cover the whole world. So I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Midori. Yeah, you have mentioned many initiatives, the circular economy, the citywide inclusive sanitation, and others. And perhaps this Water Finance Coalition could be useful also for sharing this information and knowledge. And that's one of the objectives of this Water Finance Coalition. Now, let's move to Carlos Puente. If you don't mind, Carlos, I'm going to ask in English. One of the main outcomes IRC mentioned in that study on national PDBs is that PDBs are underused, whilst having high potential to raise finance for achieving SDG 6. So we would like to know more, what is the case of Banobras and how Banobras has been working and or planning to move forward in order to boost more financing on the water sector in Mexico. And in addition, has Banobras been working on blended finance scheme using development finance to catalyze equity or loans from your own assets?
Yes, thank you very much. So to respond to the first part of the question, I would say that Banobras has been a historically relevant player in the water financing market in Mexico. We have been the main lender to state and municipal governments. And through that area of Banobras, we have been able to channel resources that combined in projects where the government's National Water Commission would place federal resources from the budget to the projects that municipalities and their water public utilities were using. Starting in the early 1990s, the National Infrastructure Fund, or its precursor, was created as a tool to provide concessional financing to water public utilities and governments that decided to develop their projects through public-private partnerships. And from that point, we have been very successful in financing sanitation projects, water treatment plants. But the challenge of fostering the efficiency in the operations of the water public utilities, helping make them financially and operationally sustainable, has been a challenge that we have been quite unsuccessful in meeting. After many years and with the creation of the National Infrastructure Fund in 2008, we started looking for better ways to meet the challenge of water investments. But at the same time, because the financing structures that were developed depended highly on the revenue transfers that the state governments and municipal governments receive for discretionary use in their spending, the projects have faced serious limitations because the municipal governments and the state governments have to allocate those resources not only in water but in many other areas. So what has become apparent to us, and what we've been discussing in the group, that the water initiative with the French Agency of Development, is that there is a clear need for a structural reform. Mexico and the water sector in Mexico developed from the dependence of water public utilities on the resources that Conagua had, and we have been a niche that has been there, but was underused, I think, because Conagua used to place a lot of resources into the water sector. Now that Conagua's budget allocations have been reduced by more than 500% in the last 7 to 10 years, we are seeing a lot of municipal governments and water public utilities come to us to develop their projects. However, we're also facing constraints in the resources available for the projects, and there's where we've been talking with World Bank and with Celine's team on how to bring more resources to the table through our knowledge of the Mexican market. Going to the second part of the question, the blended finance, I think that we have been leaders in Mexico, and I think we can provide good example of how that blended finance can work in the water sector. The National Infrastructure Funds provides the concessional financing, and Banobras' lending areas. We have the public lending area that I talked the private financing area. And we are trying to coordinate our actions better inside. We have been quite successful in doing that in the National Infrastructure Fund with the project financing area. Once we provide a grant, they will come and they will provide the financing to the private companies that are awarded the projects. And now we are looking to revise our guidelines for financing provision in the PROMAGUA, the program that I lead in the bank, also including projects that do not require public-private partnerships to develop the projects. However, the challenge remains that we have to provide the technical assistance to the water public utilities to ensure that the resources that are executed directly as a public work or as a direct financing to the water public utilities are stable and operational in the long term. That has been one of the lessons that we have learned from CONAGUA's financing. Over 500 water treatment plants that we're financing outside of Banobras' reach with CONAGUA's resources and with resources from the state and municipal governments without public-private partnerships were built but are not operating currently. So there's a challenge there because once the assets are put in operation, the costs of, for example, paying for the energy necessary to operate the assets become unpayable for the water public utilities that are not collecting enough revenues from the population, either through the water provision or for specific water sanitation charges. So there's a challenge there. I'll be glad to discuss this more at length in the next participation.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Very interesting about the PROMAGUA program. Now I'm going to ask Mr. Engineer Rubén Benítez. I'm going to switch to Spanish, but my question will be related to financial challenges and how they are working towards the universal access to water and sanitation. Ingeniero Benítez, sabemos que TAPA es una empresa municipal multiservicio en una ciudad como Cuenca de más de 500,000 habitantes y cuenta con varios créditos de multilaterales como de CAF, de AFD, del Banco Europeo de Inversiones y lleva diversas iniciativas innovadoras como el enfoque de economía circular en la planta de Huancarcucho, que nos parece que es icónica en la región de Sudamérica. ¿Cuáles son los retos financieros que tiene TAPA para los siguientes años y cómo tiene planeado atender o financiar sus proyectos hacia ese acceso universal al agua y el saneamiento? ¿Cómo ve esta iniciativa de la coalición de financiamiento de agua entre bancos multilaterales con bancos públicos nacionales como el BEDE, por ejemplo, en Ecuador? Por favor, la palabra es suya.
Muchas gracias por el espacio. Primero, por agradecerle, Franz, al Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, CAF, y a usted especialmente por la invitación que nos realizó. Muy amables por este espacio. Entendiendo un poco la dinámica de las presentaciones anteriores, más que hablar de TAPA y los proyectos, como usted mencionó, TAPA sí ha accedido a varios recursos de fondos internacionales y multilaterales, y contar qué es lo que estamos haciendo ahora. Más bien quisiera dar la visión desde el punto de vista de quienes accedemos o podemos acceder a esos recursos. Creo que es clave dentro de la línea que ustedes han planteado, esa articulación de esa iniciativa para, como coalición, lograr articular la oferta y demanda de recursos disponibles en el mundo. Sí creemos que este poco acceso, porque así lo percibimos como poco acceso que se tiene a estos recursos, básicamente es por un desconocimiento de la oferta que existe a nivel mundial. Es poca la información que permea hacia las empresas públicas de servicios de agua potable y alcantarillado, que lleva sobre las reales disponibilidades de oferta de recursos financieros a nivel mundial. Y esto parte también de que no se conoce la disponibilidad ni el alcance y requisitos que debería tener empresas como Etapa para acceder a estos recursos. Eso como primer tema. Luego, creo que es importante mencionar que precisamente esta coalición va a permitir estandarizar esta oferta de recursos, pero además definir las prioridades con las cuales esos recursos podrían distribuirse a nivel región, a nivel país y a niveles territorios, ciudades o empresas. Esas prioridades, y mencionó el Banco Mundial, prioridades entre lo urbano y lo rural, prioridades entre las ciudades que tienen mayor cobertura y mejor disponibilidad de servicio, y aquellos territorios en que todavía no han alcanzado ni los niveles mínimos o básicos de cobertura de saneamiento y agua potable, serviría para que en la oferta también se priorice la asignación y se priorice los criterios de distribución de esa oferta a nivel mundial. Nuestra posición como etapa en esta experiencia que hemos tenido durante estos años de acceso a los recursos es que hay algunos temas que desde el lado del demandante de recursos, de quien está accediendo a esos recursos, nos deberían apoyar en perfeccionarlos. La una es algo que ha ocurrido en el caso de Ecuador, es el exceso de centralización del gobierno nacional en los temas de garantías soberanas, respaldos financieros del gobierno nacional, que dificulta y hace mucho más engorroso el trámite a los gobiernos locales y a las empresas prestadoras de servicios de sus gobiernos locales. Tal vez ver cómo, quitando un poco el tema del gobierno nacional, se podía lograr calificar la capacidad de financiamiento de la empresa prestadora o del gobierno local para no entrar en ese cuello de botella que se vuelve muchas veces esta centralización de las garantías. Otro tema que es clave, y lo mencionaron varios de los panelistas, es cómo hacemos que empresas similares de etapa puedan mejorar su capacidad de gobierno corporativo. Se menciona mucho el tema de la influencia política sobre el esquema tarifario. Yo creo que hemos trabajado con CAF, Franz, usted lo conoce, de ver cómo hacemos que etapa mejore sus políticas de gobierno corporativo y un tema tarifario no sea tan engorroso políticamente y tan complicado socialmente como debería hacerlo, para permitir la sostenibilidad de empresas que incursionamos en proyectos grandes de infraestructura, pero que el momento de recuperar esa inversión o de plantear costos de operación y mantenimiento, el esquema tarifario se vuelve muy deficitario y no permite ese repago de esa obligación. Creo que también se habló de estandarizar ciertas metodologías y ciertos procedimientos, y creo que un paso que deberíamos avanzar es el cómo logramos que los proyectos ya tengan esos estándares que los organismos financieros y los organismos de financiamiento van a requerir. Muchas veces ocurre que un proyecto trabajado con una metodología diferente de un organismo que varía con diferente metodología a otro organismo, en el momento de aprobarlo, no es lo que el organismo de financiamiento está esperando. Tal vez ahí esta coalición va a permitir estandarizar bajo qué normativa, bajo qué metodología, bajo qué procedimientos se tendrán que realizar esos estudios, esos proyectos, para que la aprobación final a través de la coalición sea mucho más rápida y más oportuna. Todo el proceso de calificación de la capacidad de financiamiento, de la capacidad de endeudamiento y los requisitos y condiciones que podamos estandarizarlos igual y definirlos previamente con las instituciones oferentes de recursos, podría ser algo que avancemos. Y creo que un tema clave que a nivel Latinoamérica se vuelve muy complicado, pero que es algo que la coalición debería pensar, es el tema de transparencia y todo el tema de anticorrupción, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo fortalecemos también que esos recursos que se canalizan a países de Latinoamérica, tendremos detrás de eso también una normativa que sería la que establezcan, en este caso, la coalición o los organismos oferentes, que pongan ciertas condiciones de transparencia, que sean las que nos ayuden también a garantizar que esos recursos se utilicen de manera eficiente. Eso en cuanto a la posición nuestra como oferentes, Franz. Creo que solo cerrar que etapa, como usted mencionó, es una de las empresas que ha marcado un poco el ritmo en el país, en Ecuador, en lo que ha sido acceso a recursos y también en proyectos íconos y de avanzada en el tema de gestión ambiental y agua potable y saneamiento. Tenemos una cartera de proyectos que habría que trabajarlos un poco más a nivel de detalle y a nivel de factibilidad con las condiciones que se establezcan de los oferentes de recursos por aproximadamente 90 millones, 10 millones en lo que son la parte de gestión ambiental y fuentes hídricas y 80 millones en proyectos de infraestructura que requieren la parte urbana y rural de la ciudad. Muy buena experiencia la que hemos atravesado con CAB y Banco Europeo de Inversiones en un proyecto ícono para la ciudad, que es la planta nueva de tratamiento de aguas residuales de Huangarcucho, una planta que proyectará a la ciudad hasta el año 2070 en lo que es el saneamiento, y que a pesar de lo tortuoso que puede haber resultado el proceso, con pandemia incluida en el medio, que también nos ha dificultado, sin embargo ha permitido tener acceso a estos recursos, y el proyecto estamos ya con luz verde de CAB y BI, adjudicando los contratos a finales de año, y pensamos iniciar las obras ya civiles al segundo trimestre del año 2022. Ha habido un muy buen apoyo también de GIZ y KfW junto con CAP para lo que son estudios relacionados con los procesos de planta de tratamiento y también estudios relacionados con proyectos complementarios al tratamiento de aguas residuales, como es el manejo de lodos y el tema de infiltraciones de agua también. Entonces, hay cosas que mejorar de lado y lado, creo, del lado de los prestatarios, de los lados de los prestamistas también, y creo que estos foros y la iniciativa de la coalición de financiamiento del agua permitirá que esta oferta se conozca más, se difunda más, se priorice de mejor manera en los países de las regiones y podamos quitar y eliminar algunos cuellos de botellas que han dificultado más bien esta relación para que podamos beneficiar al interesado final, que son los ciudadanos de nuestros países. Muchas gracias, Franz. Creo que estoy dentro del tiempo. Muy amable.
Muchas gracias, ingeniero Benítez, por sus palabras. Thank you very much, Engineer Benítez, for your explanations. Unfortunately, we're over time. We still have 4 to 5 minutes just to concluding remarks. So I would like to just summarize some of the questions. And unfortunately, at the Water Finance Coalition, we're going to have a meeting in coming months. So perhaps we could try to manage some of the questions that have been coming in this chat box. Some of the questions were about blended finance and how loans can be managed under climate change effects, how can PDBs better partnering with foundations and philanthropic organizations, the experience of PDBs providing loans to NGOs, and what are PDBs doing on blended finance to attract more private investment. So I think there are many questions around, many questions ahead. We don't have time, unfortunately, but I think that there are very key questions in order to discuss a little bit more and perhaps to program another session, not as part of the World Water Week, but a specific invitation from the Water Finance Coalition to discuss a little bit more on these important issues. So because we don't have time, let me just pass the floor to Mrs. Paloma Perez de Vega. She is the head of Division Project Finance Global Partners from the European Investment Bank for the closing remarks. So please, Mrs. Vega, Perez de Vega, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. So, dear colleagues, in their interesting opening remarks, AFD and CAF have explained to us that there is a clear gap in the mobilization of funds for investing in SDG 6 in a warring climate change context. More than 2,000 million people in the world still lack access to safely managed drinking water. Gilles Kleitz's call for action encourages us, public finance institutions, to strengthen our catalyst role to finance water and sanitation investments and to pull in private financing. Julian Suarez has reminded us that we need to act together to develop innovative sources of financing to increase SDG 6 financing for all. Despite the clear need to do more, there are encouraging steps, such as the creation of the Water Finance Coalition in November 2020. The goal of this coalition is clear: to intensify cooperation and alliance between public development banks and stakeholders on these topics. Later, Steph Smits from IRC elaborated on the most relevant findings of the AFD finance study, the role of national public development banks in financing water and sanitation SDG 6. It was quite relevant to see that national PDBs are key players in financing this sector, which represents 5 to 15% of their lending portfolio. At the same time, it was confirmed that PDB's role could be further enhanced, for instance, by increasing their actions in project preparation, technical assistance, and local currency financing. The report issues a clear recommendation to governments and IFIs to strengthen PDB's ability to prepare and finance water investments. Where public-private partnerships, PPPs, are sought, particularly for some of the larger scale investments, PDBs are well placed to take on project preparation risks, as we also heard earlier from Banobras' experience in PF, project finance. I encourage the audience to read this enlightening report. After these interesting findings, we had a very good exchange of information from the colleagues in AFD, World Bank, Banobras, and Etapa Cuenca. AFD remarked the most relevant conclusions of the study for them. For example, that the coalition has been shown as relevant for increasing investment in PDBs. The demand and supply for financing do not meet, so PDBs will need to create new instruments and new TA to improve the bank's capacity, so this demand is closer to be met. There should be complementarity between IFIs and PDBs. It is not so often that PDBs can influence much to create an enabling environment, so there's room for more coordination. The study is showing that climate change and biodiversity are not reflected enough in the current financing. These issues should be reflected. For the World Bank, it is quite important to maximize synergies of working together. Midori explained the most important guidelines and actions for the World Bank to increase and improve water and sanitation in the different countries. Carlos Puente from Banobras explained the limitations of the water financing due to several reasons, like lack of sufficient funding and a need for structural reforms. Mr. Benitez pointed out several important issues, such as how water utilities should improve governance, tariff systems should be more agile, and strengthening compliance against fraud and corruption for the sake of transparency. As a representative of the European Investment Bank, I would like to add some important points. Climate change is all around us. According to the latest IPCC report number 6 in August this year, evidence of observed changes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, and droughts, and in particular their attribution to human influence, has strengthened since the previous report. This is having critical impact on water resources. The EIB, as the EU Climate Bank, has committed that all financing activities must be aligned to the goals and principles of the Paris Agreement by the end of this year. We will increase our support to climate action to exceed 50% of our total lending by 2025. It is currently 37% last year. Water and sanitation projects are crucial to achieving this goal. Last year, the bank signed a record €4 billion to this sector, double the amount of the last 2 years. Investments included, for example, near energy neutral wastewater treatment plants, water supply systems, coastal protection projects restoring ecosystem and biodiversity. The EIB will continue supporting these projects together and through public development banks that can maximize positive impact. Achieving universal access to safely managed sanitation and water services by 2030 will require a 4-fold increase in current rates of progress. Please join me in thanking the Water Finance Coalition for raising awareness of these issues during the World Water Week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Paloma Perez de Vega, and thank you very much to all the speakers, the panelists, and the audience. We are out of time, so thank you very much for joining us. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.